The cold was already ancient when the expedition crossed the last known coordinates. Not the ordinary cold that gnaws at exposed skin, but a deeper presence, something that felt embedded in the ice itself, as if the frozen world remembered every step ever taken upon it. In the year 1909, long before satellites or aerial surveys, the polar sea remained a vast white silence, an uncharted void stretching beyond the limits of certainty. It was here that the expedition journals began to change in tone, shifting from confident observations to fragmented, uneasy reflections that hinted at something profoundly wrong. The men had come north, chasing distance and legacy. Their sleds creaked under the weight of supplies, canvas tents stiff as boards, breath freezing into pale clouds that lingered longer than they should have. Compasses behaved strangely this far up, needles trembling as if uncertain of truth. Yet the maps insisted there was nothing ahead but ice, pressure ridges, and eventually open sea. That belief held firm until the morning the tracks appeared. They were discovered at first light, when the sun hovered low and red near the horizon, barely rising above the endless white. One of the men noticed depressions in the snow beyond the perimeter of the camp, indentations too deliberate to be the work of drifting ice or wind. At first glance they resembled footprints, but not of any animal known to the Arctic. They were spaced with unsettling regularity, each mark pressed deep, as though whatever made them carried immense weight, yet moved with purpose rather than struggle. The leader of the expedition recorded that moment with restraint, describing the tracks as anomalous formations likely caused by ice collapse. But later entries, written in a different hand, were less certain. These impressions did not wander aimlessly. They formed a path, a line, and that line led north, straight toward the frozen sea, where the ice thinned and cracked like old glass. As the men gathered around the tracks, a silence fell over them that no one spoke of directly. They were experienced explorers, hardened by months of isolation, yet something about these marks disturbed them beyond reason. The shape suggested a bipedal gait, but the scale was wrong. Too long, too deep. Each step was longer than a man's full stride, yet perfectly balanced, as if the creature had no need to adjust its weight on the treacherous surface. The dogs refused to go near them. Leashes pulled taut as the animals whined and dug their paws into the snow, eyes wide, noses low. One handler later wrote that the dogs smelled something beneath the ice, something old and unfamiliar, as if the sea itself exhaled through the frozen crust. They debated turning back. Supplies were already strained, and morale had begun to fray after weeks without landmarks or variation. Yet the tracks presented a choice no map had prepared them for. To ignore them felt like abandoning a truth they had stumbled upon by accident. To follow them meant stepping into the unknown, not just geographically, but existentially. So they followed. The trail stretched for miles, crossing pressure ridges and fields of broken ice, refrozen into jagged plates. The tracks never faltered. Where the ice cracked, they continued across sections that should not have supported such weight. Where the wind erased all other signs, these impressions remained, sharp-edged, preserved like fossils in motion. The men began to notice that the farther they walked, the quieter the world became. Even the wind seemed to pull back, leaving an oppressive stillness that pressed against their ears. Midway through that march, one of the journals included a strange aside, almost conversational in tone, as if the writer needed reassurance from beyond the ice. He asked, quietly and without explanation, where the reader might be observing from, as though distance itself mattered, as though being witnessed could anchor them to reality. And if you are listening to this now, from somewhere far from the cold, ask yourself the same thing. From where are you watching this story unfold? The men began to feel watched, not in the paranoid sense born of exhaustion, but in a way that felt measured, deliberate, as if something ahead of them was aware of their approach and neither hastened nor slowed its pace. At night, inside their tents, they reported sounds like ice shifting beneath their sleeping mats, subtle movements that did not register as cracks or groans, but as something more intentional, almost like footsteps echoing through solid ground. One evening, as the low sun dipped and stained the horizon, a bruised violet, the tracks changed. They no longer pressed downward, but angled slightly, as though descending. The ice ahead sloped gently toward the polar sea, where dark lines of open water cut through the frozen expanse. The smell of salt grew stronger, carried on air that felt warmer and wrong. Fear began to erode discipline. One man refused to continue, insisting the tracks led to something beneath the ice, not across it. Another argued that this was precisely the discovery that would secure their names in history, proof that the polar regions hid secrets beyond human imagination. Their leader remained outwardly calm, but his handwriting betrayed him, letters tightening, sentences shortening, as if language itself was failing him. It was here, standing at the edge of the frozen sea, that they saw where the tracks ended, or rather, where they did not. The final impressions led straight onto a stretch of ice too thin to bear a man's weight. Beyond it lay open, black water, gently moving, unfrozen despite the temperature. The tracks continued across the surface, not breaking the ice, not sinking, but vanishing, as if whatever made them simply walked out over the sea and disappeared beneath it. No return tracks, no signs of struggle, just an abrupt absence. One of the men began to laugh, a sharp, brittle sound that echoed too loudly in the empty air. Another dropped to his knees, pressing gloved hands into the snow, as if grounding himself against a sudden vertigo. The leader ordered an immediate retreat, his voice steady but hollow. Whatever conviction had driven them north dissolved in that moment, replaced by an unspoken agreement that some paths were not meant to be followed to their end. Before they turned back, one of them did something no one could later explain. He stepped closer to the edge and stared into the water for a long time, eyes unfocused, as if listening. When he finally returned to the group, his face had changed. He would say nothing more for the rest of the journey south. If this story is drawing you in, if you feel that quiet pull toward the unknown just as they did, consider staying with this journey. Subscribe, and walk a little farther into the dark with us. Some stories only reveal themselves to those willing to follow the tracks. That night, far from the edge of the sea, the men heard something moving beneath the ice again, and this time it was not retreating north. The second day after they turned south, the weather shifted with unnatural precision, as though the sky itself had been waiting for them to make that decision. The wind rose without warning, carving long streaks of powdered ice across the plain. It carried with it a sound that was not the moan of the storm, but something deeper, a resonance like a pulse buried beneath miles of frozen stone. The men huddled close, shouting against the wind, their faces half hidden by frost. They believed they had escaped what they had found, but the storm moved as if following their retreat, closing the path behind them and erasing the world into white. For hours they could see nothing but each other's shadows flickering through the snow. Their sleds vanished into drifts. The compass needle spun aimlessly again, and then, As quickly as it had risen, the storm ceased. The silence afterward was total. Even their breathing seemed too loud. When visibility returned, they realized that the landscape around them had changed. The ice beneath their boots bore faint impressions, not deep, not new, but the same strange pattern of tracks they had followed north, only this time they circled the camp. The leader tried to rationalize it, suggesting the storm had distorted old impressions. But there was something deliberate in the spacing, in the way the prints stopped just short of each tent, as though whatever made them had paused to listen. No one slept that night. The dogs, restless and trembling, pressed close together and refused to move until morning. When the light returned, the tracks were gone again. Not filled by snow, gone. Their journals began to show signs of decay after that point. Pages warped by frost, ink faded and inconsistent. It was as if the cold itself resisted being documented. But among the surviving pages, one entry stands out, written by the youngest member of the team. He described waking in the night to a faint sound like a distant bell, rhythmic and low. He thought it came from beneath the ice. When he pressed his ear to the frozen ground, he could hear it more clearly, a slow, deliberate thudding, like something immense moving far below. The others dismissed it as auditory fatigue, yet 2 nights later, the same sound returned, closer. One man claimed the ice trembled under his feet. Another said he felt warmth seeping upward from below, impossible warmth in a world defined by cold. They began to argue, torn between fear and the need to explain what they could not comprehend. And always, between those arguments, silence returned, an expectant, watching kind of silence. The leader's final cohesive entry before the group began fragmenting records an image seen at dawn, a thin mist hanging low over the ice, glowing faintly in the dim light. Through it, shapes moved, slow, tall, almost human silhouettes, distorted by distance and haze. He wrote that they seemed to walk not upon the surface, but through it, as if the ice offered no resistance. When the mist lifted, the figures were gone, but their impressions remained faintly visible, stretching once again toward the north. They followed those prints for another day, driven by something that felt less like curiosity and more like compulsion. Even the skeptics fell silent. The air grew denser, heavy with a scent like salt and metal. The ice beneath them began to resonate faintly with each step, humming as though the sea below was not entirely still. At night, when the aurora rippled across the horizon, its green and violet light revealed fractures beneath the ice that seemed to glow from within. One man said he saw movement beneath the fractures, like shadows shifting under glass. The others refused to look. That night, their campfire refused to burn properly, the flame sputtering and bending toward the ice as if drawn downward. Fear had ceased to be sharp. It had become a slow, thick thing that clung to them. The sense of being watched returned, not from above or around, but from below. The youngest member wrote that when he stared at the ice too long, he felt something stare back. It was during this phase of the expedition that one of their sled dogs disappeared. No tracks, no sign of struggle, just gone. The next night, 2 more vanished, their chains unbroken. The remaining animals refused food. The men could hear them whimpering softly, eyes fixed on the frozen ground. As the supplies dwindled, they faced the choice again. Continue south toward the known or turn once more toward the unknown. The leader insisted they move homeward, but some of the men hesitated. One, whose name was later found half-scratched in the logbook, argued that turning back was useless, that the thing they had found, or awakened, was already following them. He claimed it was not a creature, but a memory of one, an imprint that had never left this place, moving still through the patterns of ice and time. The others tried to silence him, but his words lingered. That night, he walked out of camp without his coat. They found no body, only a series of fresh prints leading once again toward the sea. From that point on, the group fell apart in spirit. Journals became brief and desperate. The ice breathes, one line reads, and sometimes I feel it waiting. Another entry mentions voices carried on the wind, too faint to understand, yet arranged like speech. The lighter's handwriting becomes erratic, his ink smeared by shaking hands. He writes that the tracks now appear ahead of them no matter which direction they travel, always just beyond reach. If you followed this far into their descent, you can almost feel the cold closing in, the silence gathering weight. It's here that you might want to linger a moment, subscribe, stay with the sound of the wind and the stories buried beneath it. Because from this point onward, what they found is not something that can be fully seen, only felt through the fragments they left behind. When the final storm came, it was not snow that fell, but shards of ice that sang as they struck the ground. The men tried to shield their faces, their tents shredded by the wind. Through the whiteout, one of them screamed, not in pain, but in awe. He claimed to see shapes moving across the sky, enormous and fluid, glowing faintly like reflections through deep water. And when the storm ended, only 3 men remained. The others had vanished without a sound, their tracks ending in neat, deliberate lines, leading once again toward the frozen sea. By the time the survivors realized they were alone, the world around them had shifted into something unrecognizable. The horizon was gone, devoured by fog that shimmered faintly in pale bands of color, neither dawn nor dusk. Their compass needles had stopped entirely, trembling in place as though suspended by invisible breath. The remaining 3 men stood amid the silence, unable to tell which direction led home. The ice beneath their boots looked different now, darker, slicker, as though light refused to cling to it. They spoke little, conserving what energy and sanity they still possessed, yet each carried the same private thought, that the land itself no longer wished them there. Their leader, now hollow-eyed and gaunt, insisted on keeping a journal. He wrote not for discovery anymore, but as an act of survival, a way to preserve thought against the quiet that pressed closer every hour. His entries changed. Dates disappeared. Sentences broke apart, scattered into fragments, filled with questions that no longer sought answers. He mentioned seeing lights below the ice, faint and rhythmic, pulsing like a heartbeat deep beneath the frozen surface. Another survivor, Anders, claimed to have heard a low hum echoing through the ice at night, a sound that resonated in his chest. He said it matched the rhythm of his own pulse. The 3rd man, called Thorn, had stopped sleeping entirely. He spent nights standing outside the ruined tents, eyes fixed northward toward the frozen sea. Once, the leader found him kneeling in the snow, whispering to something unseen beyond the fog. When asked who he was speaking to, Thorn only replied, "They're listening." After that, the leader began to mark every sound, each shift in the wind, each tremor beneath their feet, as though keeping record could hold back whatever waited beneath the ice. Food was gone by then. Their firewood, too damp to burn, smoked without flame. Hunger no longer felt like pain, but a dull echo, as if their bodies had begun to forget what warmth meant. On the fourth night, the fog grew thicker, and the temperature rose slightly, which should have been impossible. The ice sweated underfoot, slick with moisture. Through the fog, something vast moved, not close, but visible enough to distort the horizon, like a shadow under glass. The leader wrote that it moved with slow deliberation, gliding without sound. He compared it to a thought passing through the sea. The men stood motionless, watching that shadow drift beneath the frozen surface, impossibly large and formless. The air around them vibrated softly, a resonance that made their bones ache. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the shape was gone, leaving the fog trembling in its wake. Afterward, Thorn began to change. His eyes no longer focused on the men around him. He claimed he could still see it moving far below, circling, waiting. His speech became rhythmic, almost like a chant, repeating phrases in a language neither of the others recognized. Sometimes he fell silent, mid-sentence, tilting his head as if listening to something that spoke only to him. At times he laughed softly, the sound dry and hollow, and said, "It's not gone. It remembers us." Anders, terrified, begged the leader to abandon the journals and flee south by instinct alone, leaving behind their instruments and supplies. But every direction now seemed the same, an unbroken expanse of ice that rearranged itself subtly with each passing hour. They began to find their own footprints frozen in the snow ahead of them, identical in shape and spacing, looping endlessly back toward their abandoned tents. The cold had stopped biting. It no longer hurt. Instead, it numbed everything into stillness. Their breath came out thick and gray, not white, hanging longer in the air. The sky had turned the color of ash. Somewhere far off, a crack ran through the ice, long, slow, deep, like the world itself exhaling. When Anders vanished, it happened without sound. He had been walking just ahead of the leader, no more than 10 paces apart, when the fog folded inward for an instant, swallowing him whole. There were no footprints, no cry, no break in the snow. Only the echo of that deep hum beneath the ice, steady and patient. Thorn and the leader stood staring at the place where he had been, their breath shallow, neither daring to move. Then Thorn turned and began walking back toward the sea. The leader followed, unable to stop him, unwilling to be alone. The fog grew brighter as they approached the water, glowing from below with that same pulse of hidden light. The ice at the edge of the sea was thin now, webbed with cracks. Through the fractures, the leader saw movement, slow spirals of shadow beneath the surface, coiling like smoke in water. Thorn stepped closer, whispering that they had been called. His voice was calm, almost reverent. He said the tracks had never belonged to something living, but to something remembered, a remnant of a time when the ice itself had consciousness, when the ocean thought in shapes too vast for men to understand. He said it was not hunting them. It was waiting for them to return. The leader tried to pull him back, but Thorn's expression was serene. He looked upward, and for a moment his eyes reflected faint light from below, an impossible gleam, as though the sea beneath the ice looked back through him. Then the ice broke. The sound was sharp but distant, muffled by fog. The leader fell backward as the sea opened in silence, swallowing Thorn without a splash. The crack sealed moments later, the ice knitting itself smooth. The leader wrote his final coherent entry after that. It did not take him. He went willingly. The tracks were not leading north. They were leading downward. For 2 more days, The leader wandered the ice alone. His entries became erratic, mixing fragments of prayer with scientific notations. He described seeing the lights again, rising this time. Soft columns of illumination moving through the fog, reaching upward like hands. He claimed to hear voices now, but not in words. They were tones, low, harmonic, almost musical. Each time he heard them, the ice seemed to ripple faintly, as if responding. He stopped writing after that. The last page of his journal contains no words, only deep grooves where the pen had pressed too hard and broken through the paper. Weeks later, another expedition found the abandoned camp. No bodies, no supplies, only fragments of the journal, half frozen beneath the remains of a tent. The final pages were warped and water-stained, yet the ink still legible. Investigators noted something strange. The lower sections of the pages were wet, though the temperature was far below freezing. The moisture was not meltwater, it was salt. They never found the sleds or the dogs, only the faint impression of footprints circling the site. Massive, evenly spaced, and leading once more toward the sea. Years passed, and rumors spread. Some claimed that under certain conditions, when the fog rolls low across the Arctic ice, one can still hear faint, rhythmic sounds beneath the surface. Others said that ships passing too far north sometimes report seeing lights beneath the water, moving slowly, following them for miles. A naval vessel in 1917 recorded an incident where the sonar equipment picked up vibrations from below that resembled a pattern, not random noise, but a repeated pulse in sequences of 3, like a coded signal. The recording was archived, sealed, and eventually forgotten. And yet explorers who still cross those northern routes speak of strange phenomena, the feeling of being watched from below, of hearing something vast breathing beneath the ice. Some say that when the aurora burns brightest, the frozen plain seems to shimmer and faint impressions appear, enormous tracks that lead nowhere and end at the edge of the sea. There is a theory whispered among polar researchers, even now, dismissed officially but shared quietly over drinks and data logs, that the 1909 expedition did not find something new, but disturbed something ancient, something that sleeps not in the depths of the sea, but within the ice itself, waiting for the world to thaw enough to rise again. The ocean forgets nothing. Every shipwreck, every lost soul, every secret that sinks beneath its surface remains suspended in the cold dark. Perhaps those men never vanished at all. Perhaps they simply stepped across a threshold too thin for the living to see, following the same tracks that vanish into the frozen horizon. And if you've come this far, listening to their descent through time and frost, take a moment. Stay with this channel. Stay within the silence of their story. Subscribe, if only to remember that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only witnessed. Because sometimes the sea still moves beneath the ice, and when it does, the echoes sound like footsteps returning. Decades after the disappearance of the 1909 polar expedition, their story had hardened into legend. Newspapers called it a tragedy of ambition, a cautionary tale about the limits of exploration. Officially, the records listed the cause of death as exposure and loss in storm conditions. Yet, buried in restricted archives were fragments of recovered materials, warped notebooks, torn cloth samples, and a small metallic cylinder sealed tight with corrosion. Its contents remained unexamined for years, until a modern research team, stationed near the same coordinates, rediscovered it beneath several meters of ice. Inside was a strip of photographic film, The film was fragile, its surface fractured like frozen glass. When carefully restored, it revealed 7 frames. The first 3 showed ordinary scenes. The men standing by their tents, snow-blind and weary, but still alive. The next 2 were blurred, as if the lens had caught motion that light itself could not process. The final 2 frames, however, were different. They depicted a horizon split by mist, and something on it, a series of marks stretching into the distance. Tracks, enormous, perfectly spaced impressions leading across the sea, just as the journals described. Scientists dismissed the photographs as exposure artifacts, illusions created by light and frost, but those who examined the negatives privately disagreed. There was structure in those marks, pattern and rhythm, too precise for coincidence. When the images were digitally enhanced, faint glimmers appeared within the mist. Reflections, perhaps, or lights below the ice. The discovery reignited interest in the lost expedition. A documentary crew joined a scientific survey team in retracing the route described in the journals. Their vessel, the Vantage, was equipped with advanced sonar and electromagnetic sensors designed to map subglacial structures. The expedition leader, Dr. Eliza Moreau, believed the 1909 team had stumbled upon a rare geological phenomenon, an under-ice cavern formed by volcanic heat. Her goal was to locate it, not for legend, but for data. Yet as the Vantage moved northward, the readings began to behave in ways no one could explain. Magnetic interference increased the closer they drew to the coordinates. Instruments flickered, recording impossible depths beneath what should have been solid ice. The sonar returned, echo-shaped not like rock, but like movement. Slow, deliberate movement, pulsing upward from far below. Crew members dismissed it as equipment malfunction, but Moreau noticed the pattern repeating in intervals identical to the pulse frequency recorded by the 1917 naval vessel. The fog arrived on the 3rd day. Thick, white, soundless. Radio communication faltered. Visibility dropped to meters. Through that silence, the ice beneath the ship began to vibrate with a deep, rolling hum. The crew gathered at the deck's edge, watching as faint lights shimmered beneath the surface. They moved with impossible precision, tracing lines that converged directly beneath the Vantage. Below, the sonar recorded something immense rising slowly toward them. A shape that occupied nearly the entire lower half of the display, so vast it appeared more like landscape than creature. But there was rhythm in its ascent and heat signatures, faint but measurable. For hours it hovered there, just below the ice as though observing. Then as quickly as it appeared, it withdrew, sinking into silence once again. That night, Dr. Moreau reviewed the recovered journals by lantern light. Her notes reveal a growing unease, not fear, but recognition. She wrote that the 1909 leader's final phrase, "The tracks were leading downward," might have referred not to direction, but to descent, a passage between worlds. She theorized that what the early explorers found was not a physical creature, but a remnant, a resonance left by something long extinct, imprinted in the ice like a fossilized thought. But even that theory failed to explain what happened next. Near midnight, the fog thickened into a solid wall, and the temperature began to rise again. By 10 degrees, then 15, climbing beyond any recorded anomaly. The ice groaned. Metal on the Vantage began to sweat condensation despite the surrounding cold. Crew members rushed to seal lower compartments as cracks echoed across the hull. The hum returned, louder this time, vibrating through the ship's frame like a pulse. At Otuathstein, according to the surviving log, All electrical systems failed simultaneously. The sea went dark. The fog turned faintly luminescent, glowing from below in slow waves, as though lit by something vast beneath the ice. Through the thick translucent surface, the crew saw outlines, hundreds of them, immense impressions rising and fading in sequence, like steps forming upward from the deep. Tracks. One crewman shouted that he saw movement between the lights. Silhouettes walking across the underside of the ice, enormous and slow, as if reenacting an endless journey. Their forms were indistinct, but the rhythm of their motion mirrored human gait. The men and women stood frozen, unable to look away. Then, without warning, the ice directly beneath the Vantage fractured, splitting with a single resonant crack that echoed through the fog like thunder. The ship listed sharply to port. Instruments flared to life for a brief instant, recording one last sonar pulse, a wave pattern that stretched outward in perfect concentric rings before vanishing completely. Then the signal ceased. The Vantage was never heard from again. Weeks later, a search mission found fragments of the vessel's hull embedded in the ice, miles from its last known location. There was no sign of the crew, no debris field, no trace of the ship's engines. The area around the wreckage bore shallow impressions resembling footprints, each one nearly 2 meters in length, leading toward the open water. Officials attributed the loss to catastrophic ice failure, but locals from nearby research stations whispered another story. They claimed that the fog in that region never fully cleared afterward, that on quiet nights the ice still trembles faintly, and the same low hum can be heard through the hulls of passing ships. Some say the fog carries whispers, not of voices, but of breathing, long and slow, echoing from beneath. And sometimes, when the aurora burns brightest, faint lights move below the ice again. They drift in long lines, crossing one another like veins of fire, vanishing just before dawn. A century after the first expedition vanished, the sea remains unchanged, the same frozen expanse, stretching to infinity. Yet if you study the satellite images closely, patterns emerge, not random cracks, but alignments, parallel lines etched into the ice as though pressed by colossal weight. They always appear after storms, and always fade before the next sunrise. Historians argue whether the story of the 1909 expedition was ever meant to be solved. Perhaps it was never about what they found, but about what found them. The frozen sea, after all, is not empty. It is a mirror. Everything that crosses its surface leaves a reflection, and sometimes reflections do not fade. The recovered journals, preserved in temperature-controlled vaults, still emit a faint salt residue. Scientists who've handled them describe a strange sensation, as if the paper pulses softly under their fingertips, like the echo of a heartbeat. No explanation has been offered, and yet some nights, deep within the archives, the humidity sensors spike without reason. The sound technicians reviewing the old recordings claim they can hear something faint in the background. Rhythmic, distant, steady, a slow, deliberate beat, like footsteps. Perhaps that is all the Arctic ever was, a vast recording, a living memory of what once walked there. The ice does not forget. The sea does not forgive. So if you ever find yourself far north, where the compass spins and the wind grows too quiet, and you notice long impressions stretching into the fog, turn back. Do not follow, because the tracks do not lead outward, they lead in. And if this story has kept you close to the fire tonight, listening to the breath of the frozen world beyond, remember to hold on to it. Like the explorers, you've followed the tracks into the dark and returned, for now. Leave a mark of your own. A like, a comment, a sign that you are here before the ice closes again. Subscribe, so that the next time the sea stirs beneath the frost, you will be among the first to hear it call.